Well, exactly 5 weeks from tonight, we will be reporting to you what happened. In the first day of jury selection in Georgia, Judge Scott McAfee's courtroom for the first trial of two of Donald Trump's criminal co-defendants in Georgia. The Friday before that, at 8:30 a.m. in Fulton County Courthouse, 450 people will sit down and complete juror questionnaires under oath. This might look like the SATs being administered at a local high school, but with adults of all ages, filling in their answers to questions designed to eliminate bias in the jury pool. They will be the first of thousands of potential Georgia jurors who will eventually be filling out those forms in a still unknown number of trials in Georgia of Donald Trump and his 18 co-defendants. There will be at least 2 trials, we know that. Donald Trump testified once again in his own defense yesterday, not under oath, on TV. He gave testimony that can and will be used against him in both the Georgia criminal case and in the Washington, D.C. federal criminal case brought by Special Prosecutor Jack Smith, accusing Donald Trump of defrauding the United States in his attempts to overturn the presidential election leading up to and on January 6th. Donald Trump also testified in his own defense in that television interview in the Florida federal case in which Special Prosecutor Jack Smith has charged Donald Trump with violations of the Espionage Act and obstruction of justice. To evaluate Donald Trump's criminal defenses offered on television yesterday, we are joined by Andrew Weissmann, former FBI general counsel and former chief of the criminal division in the Eastern District of New York. He's a professor at NYU Law School and the co-host of the podcast Prosecuting Donald Trump. Also with us, Joyce Vance, former U.S. attorney and professor at the University of Alabama School of Law. They are both MSNBC legal analysts. The host of Meet the Press, Kristen Welker, asked Donald Trump why he ignored the legal judgments of his Attorney General, William Barr, and his White House counsel, Pat Cipollone, when they told him that there was no election fraud and that Joe Biden was the winner of the presidential election. Let's listen to that.
The most senior lawyers in your own administration and on your campaign told you that after you'd lost more than 60 legal challenges, that it was over. Why did you ignore them and decide to listen to a new outside group?
Because I didn't respect them.
You'd hired
lawyers,
them.
Sure, but that doesn't mean, you hire them. You never met these people. You get a recommendation. They turn out to be rhinos or they turn out to be not so good. In many cases, I didn't respect them. But I did respect others. I respected many others that said the election was rigged. Look, we have many people, and it's my choice. I happen to know that the election was rigged.
Were you calling the shots, though, Mr. President, ultimately?
As to whether or not I believed it was rigged, oh, sure. It was my decision.
It was my decision. Andrew Weissmann, what can Jack Smith and Fani Willis do with testimony like that?
So I wanted to focus on something he said shortly after that clip where he said, I knew that we won at 10 o'clock the night of the election, because that was part of something that's gotten very little attention. But that was an effort to stop the count of votes. And the president and his allies had talked about this before the election and then tried to put it into effect on the night of the election because they knew there would be this thing called the Red Mirage. You may remember this, Lawrence, which was that Trump would be doing better on the night of the election because the mail-in votes had not been counted. So he went out and tried to get states to stop counting votes. That feeds into the 2 of the 3 charges, like a hand in a glove, which is obstruction and the 241 civil rights violation, because you can't do that. You can't not count American votes. And that was really interesting to me that he was going back to that in this interview, the sort of stop the count, because that is part of the charges in both Georgia and in D.C.
Joyce Vance, if Donald Trump doesn't take the witness stand in his own defense, How can this, in effect, this testimony of this sort from television make it in front of the jury?
So to the extent that it's relevant, prosecutors can seek to admit it, and they can play some of these video tapes in their case in chief. And you can imagine how powerful this would be. I think Mar-a-Lago is a great example where you might, for instance, have people talking about the briefings that the former president received on classified information and its handling. The prosecution could show the jury the documents, and then they could have this incredible video of Trump talking about how cavalierly he handled it because it was his and he could do whatever he wanted to do with it. It would be a very powerful presentation done like that.
So Jack Smith's indictment of Donald Trump says that on January 6th, while the Capitol was under attack, quote, the defendant repeatedly refused to approve a message directing rioters to leave the Capitol as urged by his most senior advisors. Instead, the defendant issued 2 tweets that did not ask rioters to leave the Capitol, but instead falsely suggested that the crowd at the Capitol was being peaceful. Kristen Welker asked Donald Trump about that.
Tell me how you watched this all unfold. Were you in the dining room watching TV?
I'm not going to tell you. I'll tell people later at an appropriate time.
Did you call military or law enforcement?
What?
Did you call military or law enforcement at the moment the Capitol was under attack?
I'm not going to tell you anything.
Andrew Reisman, we have entered a new stage of Donald Trump interviews like this because this is not the first time that he has overtly refused to answer a question. Usually when he refuses to answer a question, he just throws out a bunch of words that have nothing to do with the question. He's now saying, I'm not going to answer that, which does sound like he's getting some limited amount of legal advice saying there are some questions here you just must not answer.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although, you know, it's sort of haphazard as to what he decides he's going to answer and what he's not, because when he answers, it's not particularly helping himself in court. In the court of public opinion with his base, that's another matter. But, you know, I'm sure his lawyers would prefer, at least in terms of defending him in court, that he not be saying any of this. You know, but it's, to me, it is striking that in the same way that he, for instance, said, you know, I've got irrefutable, that's his quote, irrefutable evidence of election fraud, but then just decided he wasn't going to let anyone know when that's the critical issue. So I think this is all part of a game where he actually doesn't have that evidence. We've still not seen that evidence. It's been months and months and months. This really is a question of facts and law, which are the province of the court, and fiction, which is the province of Donald Trump with his base.
Let's listen to this. Donald Trump offered a new defense of his phone call with Secretary of State, Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger.
All I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have.
We had many people in the line. When I said, I spoke for an hour, I knew that many people were in the line. I knew that it was the I happen to be a really smart person. Who is going to be talking badly when I have lawyers and many other people on the line? Nobody's going to say something bad. But if it was bad, why didn't they say, sir, that was very inappropriate of you to say? Nobody said that. Nobody said, sir. It was only a long time after the call that somebody said, oh, maybe he said something wrong.
They said,
this
sir, there's
hoax.
no evidence.
This is a hoax, just like Russia.
rigged.
If I said something wrong on the call, he or one of his many lawyers that were on the call would have said, it's inappropriate what you just said. Nobody said that. We had a normal phone call.
They said there's
This
no
became...
evidence of fraud.
Joyce Vance, is there a defense in there?
No, there really isn't. I mean, you can only imagine how this call went down, to say nothing of the fact that these were Georgians on the phone call who were innately hardwired to be polite and respectful to the President of the United States. But that aside, there's no obligation that they have to say, Donald Trump, you're doing something illegal. You're trying to get us to interfere with the election count. Nothing like that changes the character of Trump's comments, which we have all heard and which we all understand.
Andrew, what do you make of Donald Trump's new angle here? No one objected during the phone call and told me to stop saying that.
Well, the people on his side, when you surround yourself with toadies, that you really can't say that the toadies I surrounded myself with didn't object. And with respect to the Georgia folks, to add to Joyce's excellent point, just remember, Brad Raffensperger taped the call. There's a reason he taped the call. He taped it precisely because he knew he was going to need it with the kind of person that Donald Trump was. And remember, he had already seen the president and how he acted with respect to the, quote, perfect call with President Zelensky. So I think that is, it's fine for him to try that as a defense. I can't imagine that's going to work.